Good afternoon, Professor Kavanaugh and class. My name is Irina Booth, and for the Module 7 research paper assignment, I chose to conduct a comparative analysis of emergency and crisis response to the 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl nuclear disasters. As we've learned throughout the course, emergency management starts with leadership, and in both events, human error played a significant factor. With that said, the nuclear power reactor design and failure at both plants was extremely different. At 3 Mile Island, critical safety features came from the pressurized water reactor. Meanwhile, the plant also had a concrete containment structure that did successfully prevent the release of almost all radioactive material. On the other hand, in the case of Chernobyl, the reactor did not have a similar containment structure. And so taking both events into consideration, the reactor design at 3 Mile Island included safety features that allowed almost all catastrophic consequences to be avoided. So I'll start with an event overview of 3 Mile Island, which occurred in the early morning hours of March 28, 1979, when the pressurized water reactor located in Unit 2 came very close to a core meltdown. Metropolitan Edison, the company responsible for the plant's operation, initially kept information about the accident very close hold. Despite having knowledge about the serious nature of the event, public notification was not given until 12 hours after the accident occurred through a news conference. In order to fully comprehend the factors that led to the accident at 3 Mile Island, it's critical to analyze the legislative, social, and cultural constructs that surrounded the nuclear energy industry in the U.S. during the latter half of the 20th century. After the end of World War II and the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a global desire and interest in nuclear energy grew. A few years later, in the United States, the Atomic Energy Commission was established, and that confirmed America's commitment to the commercialization of nuclear power. Unfortunately, the Commission was not adequately prepared to manage the influx of nuclear energy license requests while also maintaining a high level of safety. So I'll now cover emergency response to the 3 Mile Island accident, starting with mitigation. In the US, growing interest in nuclear energy dominated the Atomic Energy Commission's focus. Citizens were largely left in the dark regarding technology behind nuclear energy development, and that led to tensions that eventually came to a head in the 1970s. As a result, Congress passed the Energy Reorganization Act of 1974, which separated nuclear regulation into two organizations. The first, which was the Energy Research and Development Administration, was responsible for promoting nuclear energy. The second, which was the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or the NRC, was charged with regulation of the legacy Atomic Energy Commission. The NRC faced increased pressure from the public to renew focus on safety standards while simultaneously receiving contradictory guidance from Congress. At the same time, the chairman of the House Subcommittee on Appropriations urged safety regulations for the industry was also slammed for failing to speed up the licensing process for new plants. So now looking to safety and inspection standards that led up to the accident. On the morning of the accident, a critical leak in a seal of a pressurized water reactor caused the unit to stop operating automatically. The emergency cooling system was designed to compensate for this failure, and that involved pulling water from an emergency storage tank and running it through a secondary cooling system. While operators did initially follow established safety guidelines, procedures instructed them to slow the emergency cooling system. Instead, they chose to continue pushing at a higher rate of operation speed, causing significant fuel damage to the reactor and subsequent release of radioactive steam. Despite no loss to life, the 3 Mile Island accident proved to the government and the American public that the nuclear industry was much more dangerous than initial estimates had anticipated. So looking to accountability and oversight, it's important to note that a single party was not to blame for the accident at 3 Mile Island. Technology at the plant was still in the early and experimental stages, and the dangers of radioactive materials had not yet fully been determined. As previously stated, Congress provided the AEC and NRC with mixed information. On one hand, they were urging the pursuit of more stringent safety protocols, and on the other, they were placing pressure on the nuclear energy industry to allow for more rapid licensing. The American public was critical of the new technology and safety concerns, but they were also supportive of cheaper energy following surges in oil prices that occurred during the first half of the 1970s. As a result of the accident, the NRC was forced to accept the reality that nuclear accidents could happen despite technological advancements and the presence of automatic safety cooling systems. The Commission developed new regulations that required states and localities to establish emergency evacuation plans for the geographic area within a 10-mile radius of nuclear plants. Additionally, efforts were made to consolidate energy agencies and improve information sharing and communication. In terms of preparation, the accident at 3 Mile Island serves as a clear example of what not to do following an emergency. Human failure further exacerbated the disaster itself, and public response only worsened the crisis. In the day following the partial meltdown, the NRC continued to downplay the situation, informing the American public the danger had subsided. Government agencies also provided the public with mixed information, initially stating no evacuation was required, while later ordering women and children to leave the area. According to a 1980 report on the disaster conducted by FEMA, plans to evacuate nearby residents were made during the accident, not before. And finally, analyzing response to the accident, state and federal leadership were heavily criticized. At the time of the accident, then Pennsylvania Governor Thornburg was in his first year of office, and there's mixed reporting regarding his decision-making for evacuation. Some experts allege that he hesitated to order the evacuation of women and children, but his administration denies these claims, stating the governor made a scientific decision to move forward with the evacuation, and he even went as far as to request a subject matter expert be sent on behalf of the Carter administration in order to coordinate response efforts. After reviewing findings produced by the committee commission, then President Jimmy Carter announced to the American public his plans to increase nuclear safety standards for the nation. Due to the high price of foreign oil, President Carter argued that the U.S. could not afford to abandon nuclear power, nor could they afford to impose a lengthy moratorium on its further use. Carter's plan was comprised of 5 key lines of effort. The first involved sending a reorganization plan to Congress, and that was aimed at strengthening the role of the chairman of the NRC, to include clarifying authority and responsibility through improved safety requirements. The second part of the first line of effort was implementation of enhanced safety procedures. And finally, selection of key personnel to act in the event of a crisis. The second line of effort involved appointing a new chairman of the NRC from outside the agency and establishing a new independent advisory committee that would keep the Carter administration and the American public informed of the NRC's progress in achieving improved nuclear power safety standards. The third line of effort involved transfer of responsibility to FEMA of all off-site emergency activities and review of nuclear emergency plans throughout the nation. The fourth line of effort involved accelerating the placement of resident federal inspectors at every reactor site. And finally, President Carter's plan involved all relevant government agencies implementing the recommendations produced by the committee commission. In addition to state and federal officials, public information individuals were also heavily criticized for their crisis communication efforts, and that included the American media. A study that was commissioned by the Public Rights to Information Task Force ultimately concluded that the needs of the American public were not met. Communication issues began with the NRC and Metropolitan Edison due to their lack of planning. Neither organization had a communications management plan in place to disseminate timely, accurate, or understandable information to the public. The only mention of crisis communication within Metropolitan Edison's emergency management plan was the provision of technical support and information dissemination through the company's communications department. Journalists were ill-prepared as they lacked adequate knowledge of the nuclear industry. And as a result, they were not able to understand or even accurately convey jargon utilized by the industry to the public. Finally, recovery efforts following the 3 Mile Island accident centered around health concerns due to possible radiation exposure. In response to these concerns, the Pennsylvania Department of Health maintained a registry of more than 30,000 citizens that lived within 5 miles of the nuclear plant at the time of the event. And ultimately, they determined that no evidence of the abnormal cancers was present. The only detectable health concern that could be found was psychological stress during and shortly after the accident. Cleanup efforts of the damaged nuclear reactor took nearly 12 years, and it cost the U.S. more than $970 million. A detailed cleanup plan was developed and successfully implemented, with activities concluding in 1991. And so next I'll review the nuclear accident that occurred at Chernobyl, located in the Ukraine, on April 26, 1986. Similar to the 3 Mile Island accident, the accident at Chernobyl should not have come as a surprise. The explosions were just the latest in a long series of catastrophic accidents at Soviet nuclear power facilities. Soviet officials placed extremely stringent controls on the media's release of information, imposing prohibitions on civil servants from divulging any information to the media relating to nuclear energy efforts. Early in the morning of April 1986, a poorly planned safety test led to 2 explosions that resulted in the release of intensely radioactive fission products into the atmosphere. Irresponsibility, negligence, indiscipline, and failed public notification resulted in substantial political fallout and severe impact to the Soviet nuclear power industry. Starting with mitigation efforts, safety and inspection standards for the Chernobyl nuclear power station were the responsibility of the All-Union Ministry of Power and Electrification. Following the accident at 3 Mile Island, the Soviet government adopted a cavalier attitude toward its own nuclear energy initiatives, citing America's failure to place profits over safety. Regrettably, many of the same hazards existed within the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, even if officials refused to acknowledge them. The explosions at the Chernobyl nuclear plant were the result of a safety and maintenance test pursued by officials to ensure their reactor could withstand an accident and cope simultaneously with the loss of electric power. Operators should have stopped the experiment from continuing when warmer feed water entered the reactor, causing water to start boiling. Instead, plant regulations were violated and the generator test continued. Operators even went as far as to switch off engineering safety systems in order to complete the experiment. In terms of accountability and oversight, the plant director retained overall responsibility for accident plan implementation, with planning efforts delegated to the civil defense system. Failures surrounding execution of the plan started with the chief of the Pripyat Civil Defense Department, who only learned of the accident by chance. When formal notification was given to him, the chief deviated from standard procedure, traveling to see his deputy chief, who, it turned out, lacked any knowledge of the accident. Instead, he should have immediately proceeded to the plant to assess the situation. According to the emergency response plan rules in place, the first step officials should have taken following the explosions was to protect people and property. Next, those officials should have immediately reported information regarding the event to the next higher level of administration. In the case of Chernobyl, the shift manager should have informed plant personnel. Instead, the manager neglected his direct responsibilities, an accusation that later arose during his trial. This breach in standard operating procedure led to at least 400 workers at the plant missing the timely warning of the explosions. The deputy chief engineer for operations also deviated from operating procedure, refusing to believe that the reactor had even been destroyed. He spread false information to his supervisors, which continued up the chain of command. Dosimetrists at the plant were the only individuals who attempted to notify administration of accurate information. However, reporting procedures specified that only a shift manager could make an accident report, and so their warnings fell on deaf ears. The sole individual to properly follow the emergency management plan was the head of the power station. He successfully communicated with the ministerial supervisor at the Ministry of Power and Electrification located in Moscow, as well as party officials, informing them of the accident in a timely manner. First responders from the Pripyat fire station and medical services did arrive rapidly on scene. However, the medical service only provided a doctor's assistant, who did not have the adequate training or knowledge to diagnose victims with radiation poisoning. Both firefighters and medical personnel lacked necessary equipment, medication, and training. Effective response was further impeded by civilian and military officials who channeled information and responsibility for decision-making up the chain of command rather than acting directly on the information available. Civil defense units displayed unsatisfactory performance due to their poor training, staffing shortfalls, inadequate equipment, and a convoluted command structure that remained unresponsive to rapidly changing crisis developments. As I previously cited, public notification during Chernobyl was disastrous. Dissemination of news about danger from radiation was delayed due to preoccupation with avoiding panic. But ironically, scant coverage led to further panic among citizens. The ad hoc nature of immediate crisis response by local authorities led to many second and tertiary negative consequences, including the postponement of evacuation for Pripyat, which is a town immediately located outside of the plant's area. In an effort to shape opinion, the Soviet government painted Chernobyl as a terrible accident that was not as bad as originally expected. All documents were classified that could have shed a negative light on the country, as well as the nuclear power industry as a whole. Chernobyl differed from 3 Mile Island in its severe impact on human life. According to a report from the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences, 9,000 victims died or developed radiogenic cancers, some 4,000 children were operated on for thyroid cancer, and cataracts were increasingly seen in liquid ears in children within Chernobyl's contaminated areas. In addition to the human toll, toxic materials also poisoned water, animals, plants, and other food sources in the surrounding areas, as well as throughout the globe. Full comprehension of the impact of the Chernobyl disaster is difficult to assess, and that's primarily due to the secrecy imposed by the USSR on health data in the days immediately following the meltdown. And so to conclude, both nuclear accidents at 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl were the result of inadequate emergency crisis response.